The smell of money and secrets smells exactly the same, like aged leather, single malt whiskey, and the kind of cologne that costs more than a month of Vera's rent. She had learned that within her first week at Hargrove and Associates, the private accounting firm that occupied the 14th floor of a building whose lobby alone cost more to maintain than most people's annual salary. The clients didn't come to the office went to them, through quarterly reports delivered by hand, through discreetly formatted spreadsheets that could survive any audit, and through Vera Page, who sat at the second desk from the window and made sure the numbers always told exactly the right story. Not a false story. That was the distinction she had made with herself on day one, and she clung to it the way she clung to most things, quietly, without anyone noticing. The accounts she managed were legal. The businesses were registered. The taxes were filed. What happened between the lines of those filings was someone else's business entirely. That was what she told herself. She was good at that too, telling herself things and believing them just long enough to get through the day. Vera was 28 years old, 5'4", and built, as her mother had once put it with unintentional cruelty, like a woman who enjoyed being comfortable. She had dark brown hair she kept in a bun so tight it gave her headaches, a pair of glasses she'd had since college that she kept meaning to replace, and a talent for sitting so still in a room full of powerful men that they forgot, completely and entirely, that she was there. She had decided, somewhere around age 14, that this was a skill, not a flaw, a skill. Most days, she believed that. She arrived at the Caldwell Grand at 7:15 in the evening, 45 minutes before the quarterly dinner was scheduled to begin. The firm's senior partner, Mr. Hargrove, had called her personally that afternoon, which he never did, to tell her she would be attending in place of the senior analyst, who had come down with something unfortunate. "You'll sit in the back," he'd said. "You won't need to speak. Just observe, take notes, and be available if Mr. Ashford needs anything clarified." Mr. Ashford. Declan Ashford. She had been managing the secondary accounts for Ashford Holdings for 14 months without ever once being in the same room as the man. She knew his balance sheets better than she knew her own face. She knew which shell companies held which assets, which restaurants were fronts, and which were merely investments, which charitable foundations actually gave to charity. She knew that he was 41 years old, that he'd built the Ashford empire from a mid-level importing business his father had nearly run into the ground, and that somewhere in the last decade, the importing business had become something considerably more complex. She also knew, because she was observant in the way that only truly invisible people are, that Declan Ashford had not made his fortune by being kind. The Caldwell Grand's private dining room was on the second floor, not listed on the hotel's public directory, accessible only by a key card or by being accompanied by someone who had one. Vera had a temporary one. She kept touching it through the lining of her blazer pocket, the way some people touch a rosary. The room was already filling when she arrived. A dozen tables draped in white linen, each set with crystal that caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the ceiling like something from a dream. Men in suits that cost more than Vera's car moved between tables, shaking hands and saying nothing of importance with a great deal of gravitas. She found her assigned seat, corner table, partially obscured by a decorative column, excellent sight lines to the entire room, and sat down, opened her notebook and began cataloguing. It was what she did. She watched. She recorded. She made sense of things by writing them down, by reducing the overwhelming and the dangerous to neat rows of data. Table 3. Hargrove speaking to a man she recognized from the Chicago City Council files. Table 1. Two men she didn't know, but whose body language read as security, off-duty, relaxed, but with that particular stillness of people trained to move fast. And then the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a room changes when the pressure drops before a storm. A subtle shift in the air, in the angle of people's attention, in the collective posture of everyone present. Declan Ashford walked in at 7:58, and the room rearranged itself around him the way water rearranges itself around a stone dropped from a height. He was taller than Vera had imagined. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with the same clinical detachment she applied to balance sheet anomalies. Tall, dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to convey the message. I do not negotiate. He wore a charcoal suit that she understood instinctively had been made for him and only him, and he moved through the room with the particular economy of motion that belongs to men who have never once in their adult lives had to hurry for anyone. Behind him, 2 men. Not security. Something else. Advisors, or the kind of men who served as both. Beside him, a woman. Vera's pen paused above her notebook. The woman was blonde, early 30s, in a dress the color of red wine. She had her hand through Ashford's arm and was leaning in close to say something that made him cut his eyes sides toward her, with an expression Vera couldn't quite read. Not warmth, not coldness exactly. Something measured. Elaine Voss. She was in the files, listed as a personal associate, which in Hargrove and Associates' careful language could mean anything from romantic partner to business liaison to both simultaneously. She'd been listed on 2 of the event calendars and had signing authority on one of the personal holding accounts. Vera wrote her name in the margin of her notebook, then drew a small asterisk next to it, the way she always marked things she wanted to return to. She didn't know why she marked it. She wouldn't be able to explain it later. It was the same instinct that made her double-check figures that added up perfectly, because sometimes things that added up perfectly were the ones that had been most carefully constructed to do so. The dinner began. She watched. She took notes. She was offered wine 3 times by a server who was working the corner section and turned it down 3 times with the same small smile she used for declining everything she wanted. A bread basket appeared, and she took 1 roll, ate it methodically, and returned her attention to the room. Ashford sat at the center table. He didn't perform the way powerful men often performed at these dinners. He didn't hold court, didn't raise his voice, didn't make sure everyone was watching before he spoke. He was quieter than she'd expected. He listened more than he talked. When he did speak, the men across from him leaned forward slightly, almost involuntarily, the way plants lean toward light. Elaine, beside him, was on her phone more than she was at the table. Vera noted that too. It was during the main course that she heard it. She heard it because she was sitting next to the architectural feature no one had considered when designing a room for confidential conversations, a narrow ventilation duct that ran along the back wall. Behind her column, channeling sound with the indiscriminate efficiency of old buildings. The restaurant had been built in 1923. The walls had stories of their own, 2 voices. Male, just beyond the adjacent room's service door, which wasn't quite closed. Confirmed for 11. The shipment comes through the Lakeview warehouse, same as before. Ashford doesn't know. A pause, a sound that might have been a laugh. He won't. She made sure of that. She pulled the security rotation herself, said she was updating the calendar. And the Callaway crew. They'll be in position by 10:30. By the time Ashford realizes what's missing, it'll already be across the state line. Vera did not move. She was exceptionally good at not moving. Her pen, which had been hovering above her notebook, slowly came to rest. She breathed in. She breathed out. She looked at the half-eaten bread roll on her plate and thought, with the strange clarity that descends in moments of unexpected crisis, that she should have taken a second one when she had the chance. She had 3 options she understood immediately, with the same rapid triage she applied to accounting emergencies. Option 1, do nothing. She had heard nothing. She was a glorified note-taker at a corporate dinner. This was not her problem. The invisible woman did not intervene. Option 2, find Hargrove. Tell him what she'd heard. Hand the problem upward, where it belonged. Let someone older and more important and far better compensated deal with it. Option 3. Her eyes found Ashford across the room. He was listening to something the man across from him was saying, his expression giving away nothing, his glass of bourbon untouched. He had no idea. Whatever was coming for him at 11 o'clock tonight, he was sitting in this room, completely unaware of it, and the woman next to him, the woman with signing authority on his personal account, the woman who had adjusted his security rotation, was looking at her phone again, with an expression Vera could now, from this new angle of understanding, read perfectly. Elaine was waiting. Option 3 wasn't really a choice, Vera realized. It had never been a choice. Some people heard a warning and weighed their options. Vera Page heard a warning and thought about the numbers. The weight of what she knew against the weight of what happened if she stayed quiet. And the math was so obvious it almost insulted her. She tore a page from the back of her notebook. Small. Neat. She wrote in the block print she used for labeling file folders, because block print didn't have the loops and curves that graphologists use to identify writers. And Vera Page thought about these things, even in the middle of a crisis. Your shipment is being intercepted at the Lakeview warehouse. 11 o'clock tonight. Someone inside your organization set the window. The Callaway crew is already in position. Check who adjusted your security rotation this week. She folded it twice. Then she sat with it for 63 seconds. She counted, because counting helped her think, while she considered whether she was making the kind of mistake that couldn't be walked back. She was almost certainly making exactly that kind of mistake. She stood up anyway. Walking across the room was the longest thing Vera had ever done. Not in terms of distance. It was 30, maybe 35 feet. But in terms of the specific, concentrated effort it required to walk naturally, purposefully, without looking like someone who was doing something she shouldn't be doing. She was a woman in a modest navy blazer and sensible heels in a room full of silk and tailoring, and she was walking toward the most dangerous man in it, and she kept her eyes forward, and her breathing steady, and she thought, this is just a delivery. You deliver things all the time. Reports, documents, numbers. This is just a number, a very important number. The server from her section appeared at her elbow, apparently returning to the corner station, and she almost collided with him. She stepped sideways. He apologized. She smiled. Neither of them stopped moving. She reached the table. Up close, Ashford was even more difficult to look at directly than he'd been from across the room. Not because he was doing anything threatening, but because he was looking at her the way he'd presumably looked at every unexpected thing that had come across his table in the last 20 years, with a stillness that preceded a verdict. I'm sorry to interrupt, Vera said. Her voice was her professional voice. Even, measured, the voice she used on conference calls with clients who scared her. I work for Hargrove and Associates. I manage the secondary accounts for Ashford Holdings. My name is Vera Page. Nothing in his expression moved. I know who you are. She hadn't expected that, and she was someone who expected most things. Then you know I wouldn't be here without a reason, she said, and placed the folded paper on the edge of the table, half beneath the rim of his bread plate, in the way of someone leaving a receipt rather than a warning. I'd read that soon. She turned and walked back to her table before she could watch him open it. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at her notebook and saw that her handwriting, on the last line before the torn page, was slightly less steady than usual. She pressed the pen tip firmly to the paper and drew a short, straight line to correct it. Her heartbeat was not steady. Her handwriting would be. At the center table, she did not look. She would not allow herself to look. Instead, she tracked, as she always tracked, in her peripheral way, the temperature of the room, the sounds, the angles of attention. It changed again, more subtly this time. A private change, contained to one point. She heard Ashford's chair shift. She heard him say something quiet to the man on his left. A single sentence. The man's posture changed in the way postures change when a sentence contains an order. Elaine, beside him, looked up from her phone. Vera finally allowed herself to glance over. Ashford was reading something. She couldn't see what, because his hand had closed around the paper in the way of someone used to making things disappear. And his face was doing the thing she'd seen it do across the room. Nothing visible, nothing readable. A surface with tremendous pressure underneath it. He looked up. Across 35 feet of white linen and crystal and candlelight, Declan Ashford looked directly at Vera Page. She did not look away. She was not sure she could have if she'd tried. He held her gaze for exactly as long as it took to decide something. Then he looked away. He said 3 more words to the man on his left. Then he picked up his glass of bourbon, which had been sitting untouched for an hour, and he drank. The man on his left stood up and quietly left the room. Vera exhaled. She looked down at her notebook. She wrote, in her careful block print, 7 bourbons on table, 1 consumed. Ashford. Controlled. Then she looked up and went back to watching the room, because watching the room was what she did, and she had to do something with her hands. She didn't look at Elaine. She specifically, deliberately did not look at Elaine. The dinner concluded at 9:40. People collected their coats, exchanged final handshakes, filtered toward the elevator in the slow social current of post-dinner obligations. Vera tucked her notebook into her bag, straightened her blazer, and was calculating the exact moment she could leave without the departure being noticeable when a presence arrived at the edge of her table. She knew before she looked up. "Walk with me," Declan Ashford said. Not a question. Not quite a command. The grammar was a command, but the delivery was something else. Quieter, almost careful. Like someone who had learned to make orders sound like requests only in very specific circumstances. Vera stood up. They walked not toward the elevator, but toward a side corridor she hadn't mapped because she hadn't anticipated needing it. One of the 2 men who had entered with Ashford materialized from somewhere and fell into step behind them at a distance. The other, she understood, had probably been outside the entire time. The corridor ended in a small anteroom, a waiting area, by its furniture, for the private event spaces. Heavy curtains, 2 armchairs, the kind of room that existed to give people somewhere to be that wasn't anywhere else. Ashford stopped, turned, looked at her with an expression that was still unreadable, but was, she thought, a different kind of unreadable than before. Before had been assessment. This was something she didn't have a category for. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said, so she did. She told him in the order she had received the information, with the precision she applied to all information. The 2 voices, the specific words she could recall, verbatim, the words she was paraphrasing. The architectural reason she'd been able to hear anything at all. She told him about the Callaway crew and the warehouse and the 11 o'clock window. She told him about the security rotation, and she watched his jaw tighten. Just once, a single small movement at that part. She did not tell him who she suspected. She had no evidence for that, only math, and she was disciplined enough to know the difference. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You walked across that room," he said, "in front of 40-some people who work in financial services and can recognize a Hargrove associate on site, and handed me a note at my own table. Yes, you understand what that looks like. It looks like a glorified bookkeeper having an inexplicable moment of poor professional judgment," Vera said. "I think I can recover from that." Something happened on his face. She almost missed it. It was very fast and he seemed to catch it. But it was there. Not a smile, exactly. The architecture of a smile, disassembled before completion. "Why?" he asked. She considered the question, not whether to answer it, but how to answer it honestly without answering it entirely. "The numbers didn't add up," she said finally. "That bothers me more than most things." He looked at her for another long moment. Vera was accustomed to being looked past. Being looked at. Being really looked at. with the kind of attention this man apparently applied to everything he found worth examining, was a different experience. She kept still under it. She was very good at keeping still. Vera Page, he said, as though trying the name for sound, for weight. Yes. Who else knows you did this? No one. Anyone see you cross the room? The server from my section. He won't remember. It was a social collision, not a professional interaction. He'll remember avoiding a collision, not me. She paused. I'm generally not very memorable. You're wrong about that, Ashford said, with a flatness that made it clear he was stating a fact rather than offering a compliment. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she didn't know how to categorize. She set it aside to return to later. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? She asked. No. Then, go home. Use a car service, not a cab. Charge it to the Hargrove account. I'll have it sorted. He paused. Don't come into the office tomorrow. She started to ask why, then stopped. She understood why. Whatever was happening at 11 o'clock tonight, there would be a ripple. There was always a ripple. People would want to know who had tipped him off, and the fewer places Vera Page existed in the official record of tonight, the better. Okay, she said. Page. She had already turned. She turned back. Ashford looked at her with that specific, still intensity. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words. They were said in the same controlled, even tone as everything else he'd said. But Vera Page, who spent her professional life reading between the lines of documents that other people had carefully constructed to reveal as little as possible, heard something underneath them that made the back of her neck go warm. She went home. She took a car service. She did not sleep, because she was not built for sleeping during crises. But she made tea and sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad. And she wrote down every word of the conversation she could remember. And then she wrote down every number she could recall from Ashford's accounts that might be relevant. And then she sat for a long time in the particular quiet of a Chicago night and thought about what she had done and whether she would do it again. She would. Obviously. The math was the math. Hargrove called her at 6:15 the following morning. There was an incident last night, he said, in the tone of a man describing a weather event. Some business with a logistics facility. Mr. Ashford has requested that you take the Ashford Holdings account entirely going forward. Full portfolio. You'll be his primary contact at the firm. Vera set down her tea. That's a significant account, she said. It is. Shouldn't that go to one of the seniors? Hargrove was quiet for a moment. It was a strange kind of quiet, a quiet with texture to it. Mr. Ashford was specific. He said, he wants you. She thought about that. She thought about it for the rest of the morning, while she was not going into the office. While she was sitting at her kitchen table, making sense of numbers that suddenly looked different than they had yesterday. She had managed a portion of Ashford Holdings for 14 months from a careful secondary distance. She had known the accounts. She had not known the man. Now she had walked across a room and handed him a folded piece of paper and apparently become someone he trusted. And she was not entirely sure how she felt about being trusted by Declan Ashford, because being trusted by men like that came with a particular weight she wasn't sure her sensible heels could support. She went into the office on the 3rd day. Her desk was the same, the second desk from the window. The files had been updated overnight, a new folder, considerably thicker than the one she'd had before, sitting squarely in the center of her workspace. Ashford Holdings. Complete portfolio. She opened it. She was still reading when her desk phone rang. Mrs. Page. The voice was deep, controlled, with that particular cadence she had already memorized without intending to. I understand you're reviewing the new material. Yes, she said. I have some questions about the Meridian Trust filings. A brief silence. Then, I'll have someone send you the supplementary documents. I already found them, Vera said. That's what I have questions about. Another silence, different from the first. Are you available this afternoon? He asked. I'm available when you need me to be, she said, because that was the professional answer, the invisible woman answer, the answer she gave automatically. Then 2 o'clock, Ashford said. My office, not the satellite address, the main building. The main building was not on any public map. She knew its address because it was in the files. I'll be there, she said. She set the phone down, looked at it for a moment, with its layers of careful numbers and carefully maintained distance between what was on the page and what was behind it. She had built her entire career on being the woman in the corner, who nobody noticed, who catalogued everything and said nothing, and stayed carefully behind the line that separated observation from involvement. She understood, with the quiet certainty she applied to all accurate assessments, that she had stepped over that line 3 nights ago. Not just stepped. She had walked across it deliberately, in her sensible heels, in front of 40 witnesses, and handed the most dangerous man in Chicago a piece of paper with her neat block handwriting on it. The only question that remained was what the other side of the line looked like. It looked like this. His office was on the 15th floor of a building that presented as a private investment firm and functioned, as far as Vera could determine from the documents, as exactly that, alongside other things she was still cataloguing. The space itself was spare, dark wood, clean lines, a view of the Chicago River that cost more than the furniture, no excess, no performance. Nothing in the room that wasn't useful or wasn't chosen. She liked it, which surprised her. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the window, the way people with complicated interior lives sometimes stood at windows. Not looking at anything specific, just existing at the edge of something. He turned when she came in. Close the door, he said. She did. What followed was 2 hours of the most unusual professional conversation of her life. Unusual because it was, genuinely, a professional conversation. He asked questions. She answered them. He listened with the same complete, unperformed attention she'd observed at the dinner, and when she flagged the Meridian Trust discrepancy she'd found. He was quiet for a moment and then said, simply, "Show me." She showed him. He followed it. She had expected to translate, to simplify, to gentle the technical into the accessible the way she did with most clients. He didn't need that. He moved through the documents with a facility that told her he had understood his own accounts long before anyone else had understood them for him. This was built this way intentionally, he said, pointing at a figure. I know, Vera said. That's not actually the problem I wanted to flag. He looked at her. The problem, she said, is that someone with access to the primary accounts has been making micro-adjustments to this trust over the last 8 months. Small enough to be invisible in a quarterly review. Large enough, if you're watching for patterns, to read as a redirect. Silence. Show me, he said again. She showed him that too. The room, which had already been quiet, became quieter, the kind of quiet that has weight. You found this in 3 days, he said. I found it in about 4 hours, Vera said. I spent the rest of the time making sure I was right before I said anything. He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, not because it was becoming more legible, but because she was becoming more fluent in its specific language. It was the expression he had when something had recalibrated something else, when the world had shown him a data point he hadn't previously had, and he was quietly adjusting his entire model to accommodate it. You're not what I expected, he said. I'm exactly what my files say I am, Vera said. I think people just don't always read the whole file. This time, the smile made it further before he caught it. That's the second time in 3 days that you've said something I didn't have a response to, he said. That's not a position I'm usually in. Vera straightened the documents in front of her, aligned their edges with the edge of the desk, the way she always aligned things, because order was the system she had built to keep herself functional in disorderly circumstances. I'll have a full written analysis to you by Friday, she said. I'll need access to the primary accounts The ones I didn't have before. You'll have it by morning." She nodded, began to collect her things. Paige. There it was again, her name in that voice, with that weight. Yes? Ashford was standing now, on his side of the desk, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her, across the room 3 nights ago. The way that had made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, like someone who was being seen, rather than someone who had successfully avoided being noticed. "What I said that night," he said, "it wasn't enough." She was quiet for a moment. "It was enough," she said. "I didn't do it for the thanks. I know." He paused, and she understood he was choosing words carefully, which was not something she thought he often needed to do. That's what made it worth more than I knew how to say. Vera Page, who had spent the better part of a decade becoming an expert in finding the exact right words for the exact right situation, found, for the first time she could clearly remember, that she had no words available. She looked at her hands, then at the Chicago River through the window, then, because she was not someone who hid from accurate data, at Declan Ashford. "Friday," she said. "The analysis will be ready. I'll be here," he said. It took 8 weeks. 8 weeks of 2 o'clock meetings that ran until 6. 8 weeks of documents and discrepancies, and the slow architectural work of understanding. Not just the accounts, but the whole structure. What it was built to do, and what it had been quietly undermined to do instead. 8 weeks of Vera arriving with her notebook and her sensible heels, and her block print annotations. And Ashford meeting her across his desks with the same concentrated attention, and both of them pretending, with decreasing effectiveness, that what was happening in that room was purely professional. The redirect in the Meridian Trust traced back to a single access point. A name on the account authority roster she had seen before. She laid the final report on his desk on a Tuesday evening, 6 minutes past 7, when the building was quiet and the river outside was catching the last of the winter light. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he closed the folder with a care that was somehow controlled violence in disguise. "You're certain," he said. "I'm always certain before I say it," Vera said. He was quiet for a long time. Then how long? 14 months, she said. Beginning approximately 2 months after her signing authority was added to the personal holding account. Another silence. She understood what this silence cost him. Not the money, or not only the money. The specific weight of betrayal by someone given specific trust. She did not say anything, because she understood that some mathematics required space to be absorbed. "I need to know something," he said finally. "Okay, when did you suspect her?" Not know. Suspect. Vera thought about the asterisk in her notebook, the small mark she had made before she understood why she was making it. "At the dinner," she said, "before I heard anything. Something in the way she was using her phone." He looked at her. "I couldn't have told you then," she said. "It was a feeling, not a fact. I don't act on feelings. I wait until I can prove it, and then you act," he said. "Yes." He stood, moved from behind the desk to the window. His thinking position she had learned. The river was dark now, Chicago spread out beyond it in its winter-lit complexity. "You could have done nothing," he said, "that night at the dinner. You had no obligation, I know, but you walked across the room." "The math was very clear," Vera said. He turned from the window. Vera, not Page, not Miss Page, Vera, with a directness that he apparently saved for things that mattered. She met his eyes. "I need you to understand something," he said. "What I'm about to ask you, it's not a professional request." She waited. "Stay," he said. "Not on the account. Not for the firm. Stay because I would like you to stay. Because 8 weeks of 2 o'clock meetings has made it entirely clear to me that you are the most exceptional person I have ever been in a room with. And I have been in rooms with a significant number of people who thought they were exceptional." He paused. "And because I think you know, as well as I do, that this," he gestured briefly, "between them, is not strictly professional anymore." Vera Page looked at the man across from her, She thought about sensible heels and borrowed key cards and a folded piece of paper she'd written in block print. She thought about asterisks in the margins and numbers that didn't add up, and the specific discipline it took to know the difference between a feeling and a fact. She thought about being invisible, about the careful, practiced art of taking up as little space as possible, staying behind the column, walking through rooms without leaving footprints. And she thought about the moment she had decided to walk across 35 feet of white linen and hand a dangerous man a warning, because the math said to, and because underneath the math, something quieter and more stubborn had said the same thing. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am not easy to be around. I notice everything. I correct errors when I see them, even when it would be socially smoother to let them go. I keep very precise records, and I ask a great many follow-up questions, and I have extremely strong opinions about how documents should be organized." "I know," Ashford said, "and I'm aware that I don't look like the kind of person who, Vera," his voice was quiet, "I know what you look like. I've been looking." The room was very still. Outside, Chicago moved in all its layered complexity. The river catching streetlight, the buildings holding all their arranged secrets, the whole enormous city doing what cities do, which is contain multitudes without ever quite accounting for any of them. Inside this room on the 15th floor, the woman who had made herself invisible for years, and the man who had never once been allowed to look away from himself, looked at each other across a desk full of numbers that had finally told the truth. And Vera Page, methodical, precise, perpetually certain only after she could prove it, found that for the second time in 8 weeks, the math was already clear before she'd finished running it. She picked up her notebook, placed it in her bag, straightened her blazer. "I'll need a key card," she said, "if I'm going to keep coming back." Something happened on his face that was not the architecture of a smile this time. It was the whole thing. Unheld, undisassembled, complete. "I'll have one made," Declan Ashford said, "with your name on it."